They say a man can break any horse if he's got enough rope, enough patience, and enough pride to burn. For 11 years, that lie held up out here. 11 years, this valley watched grown men, real cowboys, the kind who'd broke 100 outlaws and never once lost their seat, come riding after one gray stallion. And every one of them went home limping, humbled, or worse. Nobody could touch him. Nobody could hold him. He'd run the ridge like the wind had learned to grow a mane, and he'd vanish into that canyon country like the earth just opened up and swallowed him whole. Folks started calling him a ghost. Some swore he wasn't even real. The younger boys made up stories to scare each other around the fire. But I'm the one who finally caught up to him. And I'm here to tell you, the reason no cowboy in this country could ever put a rope on that horse had nothing to do with how wild he was. The truth is going to sit heavy on you. It sure did on me. I've been carrying it 3 winters now, and I still can't tell it without my hands going cold. So pour yourself something, get comfortable. Because the story of that stallion is really the story of what he was running back to. And once you know it, I promise you'll never look at a wild thing the same way again. The boy went down hard, and for one long second I thought I was about to watch somebody die. His name was Cade Willett, 19 years old, and every inch of him certain he was going to be the one. You could see it in how he sat his saddle that morning, chin up, rope already coiled loose in his hand, grinning at the rest of us like we were the warm-up act and he was the main event. I'd seen that grin before. I'd worn it myself, 40 years back, and life had taken its time slapping it off my face. The stallion caught him in the open flat below Coyote Rim, right where the sage thins out and the ground goes hard and pale. Cade had swung wide to cut him off from the canyon mouth, and for a heartbeat it looked like it might even work. The gray checked up, wheeled, threw a spray of grit. Cade's rope sang out. And the horse just wasn't there anymore. I don't know how else to say it. One instant the loop was closing on a neck, and the next the animal had folded himself sideways in a way no 1,000-pound creature has any business doing, and Cade's throw sailed through empty air. The boy overbalanced. His mare planted a foot in a badger hole, and then the whole works came apart, horse, rider, rope, sky, dust, in that slow, terrible tumble that a body never forgets once it's seen it. I was already spurring toward him before the dust settled. He was alive. Wind knocked clean out of him, one wrist bent wrong, a gash over his eyebrow painting half his face red. But alive. He lay there in the dirt blinking up at the enormous blue nothing of the sky, and when he finally got his breath back, the first thing out of his mouth wasn't a curse or a cry. It was a laugh. "Did you see him?" he wheezed. "Charlie, did you see that son of a did you see that?" I had seen it. That was the trouble. I'd been seeing it for 11 years. My name's Charlie Rays, and if you'd asked anybody in this valley they'd have told you I was the best hand with a horse in 3 counties, which was true right up until the day it stopped being true and I was too old and too tired to argue. I'd broke outlaws that had broke other men first. I'd gentled colts nobody else would go near. I had a way, they used to say, a quiet in my hands that horses trusted. But I never once got within a rope's length of the gray. Nobody had. That was the whole legend of him. Let me back up, because you can't understand what happened out there without understanding the country, and the country is half the story. This is high desert, sage and greasewood and rimrock, arroyos that run bone dry 10 months a year and then try to drown you the other 2. The kind of place that looks like nothing to a stranger passing through, brown and empty and mean, but that gets under your skin if you stay long enough. My people had run cattle on the flats below the Owlhead Mountains for 4 generations. My wife Rosa was buried in the little fenced plot up by the cottonwoods, and I'd long since decided I'd be going in the ground next to her when my time came, and that was the whole of my ambition anymore. To finish out my years on the land, feed my few remaining cows, and not make a fool of myself. The stallion complicated that. He first showed up the spring after Rosa passed. I remember because I was in no state to notice much of anything that year. A man loses the woman he's loved for 31 years, and the world goes gray and flat and far away. But even in that fog I noticed the horse. He came down off the high country with a band of mares, the way young stallions do when they've split off to make their own way. Silver gray, near white on the flanks with a dark mane and tail and 4 black stockings, and a way of holding his head that made your breath catch. 16 hands if he was an inch. I watched him through my field glasses from the porch that first evening, and I remember thinking, in the dull way I thought about everything back then, now there's a horse Rosa would have loved. She'd always loved the gray ones. By that summer, everybody in the valley knew about him, and by that fall, the first cowboys had started coming to try their luck. You have to understand how much a horse like that is worth, and not just in money, though the money was real enough. A stud that magnificent, running free, was a kind of standing dare. Every roper, every mustanger, every young man with something to prove looked at that animal and saw the story he could tell for the rest of his life. I'm the one who caught the gray. They came from all over. Some of them were fools who got themselves hurt in the first hour, but some of them were the genuine article, patient men, clever men, men who'd captured wild horses their whole lives and knew every trick in the book. They built wing traps in the canyon mouths. He wouldn't enter them. They tried to run him down in relays, fresh horses posted along his routes to wear him out. He'd run for 2 days and never break, and the horses chasing him would founder first. One outfit brought in a helicopter, if you can believe it, the way they gather mustangs on the government land up north. He led that machine into a slot canyon so tight, and so twisting the pilot near killed himself and had to pull off. And I heard that pilot say afterward, white-faced, that in 20 years of flying he'd never seen an animal think like that. Because that was the thing about the gray. He didn't run scared. He ran smart. He always seemed to know exactly where you'd be before you knew it yourself. He'd let a roper get close enough to taste it, and then peel away at the last possible instant like he was doing it to be cruel, like he enjoyed it. That's what people came to believe. In the end, that the horse was proud, that he was toying with them. The legend grew and curdled, and the gray stopped being an animal in folks' minds and became a symbol of freedom, of defiance, of everything wild that men can't own no matter how hard they try. They started calling him Smoke because of the color and because of how he'd vanish. And I let them talk. I sat on my porch and fed my cows and watched Smoke run the ridge in the evenings, silver against the red rock, and I kept my mouth shut. Because I'd started to notice something the others hadn't. It was the roots. I'd lived under those mountains my whole life. I knew that country the way you know the inside of your own hand, every draw, every seep, every game trail. And after a couple of years of watching that horse, I started to see that he wasn't just running random. He came down off the high country on a schedule. Not exact, not to the day, but close. Early spring when the snow pulled back. High summer in the worst heat when any sensible horse would have stayed up where it was cool. And late fall, right before the first storms shut the passes. 3 times a year, same season every year. And every time, no matter where his band was ringing, no matter how hard he'd been pushed by ropers that season, he'd peel off alone and come down to the same place. There's a spring below Coyote Rim, a little green seep in a fold of the hills where the cottonwoods grow, the same kind of cottonwoods, I'll note, that shade my Rosa's grave, though I didn't let myself think much on that at the time. And above the spring there's a bench of high ground, flat and grassy, with a view clear across the whole valley. Smoke would go there, alone. He'd stand on that bench for the better part of a day, sometimes 2, not grazing, not resting, just standing, facing east, ears up, waiting. Waiting for what? I couldn't have told you. But I'll tell you the first time I saw him do it, something turned over in my chest that I hadn't felt since Rosa died. Because I knew that stillness. I knew that particular way of standing and facing the horizon and waiting for something that isn't coming back. I did it every evening on my own porch. So the morning Cade Willett went down and cracked his wrist and got up laughing, I made a decision that I didn't fully understand even as I made it. I decided I was going to follow the horse. Not chase him, not trap him, not rope him. I was done with all that, and I'd never really wanted it anyhow. I just wanted to know. I wanted to understand what an 11-year-old wild stallion was waiting for on a lonely bench of grass 3 times a year, because I had a feeling, a cold, sure, unaccountable feeling, that the answer was going to matter to me, that it was going to explain something, maybe about the horse, maybe about myself. I got Cade patched up and sent him back to town in the bed of my truck, cussing and grinning and already planning his next attempt. Good kid, too much like I used to be. Then I saddled my old buckskin gelding, Domino, who was near as ancient as me and about as ambitious, and I rode out slow after smoke. I didn't try to keep up. That was the trick I'd figured out and nobody else had. You couldn't keep up with that horse, and if you tried he'd know it and he'd lose you inside of a mile. So I didn't. I just rode toward the bench above the spring, taking my time, letting the day go long and hot around me, and I trusted that he'd be there. He was. I stopped Domino a good quarter-mile off, downwind, in the shadow of a rock spine where I figured I'd be hard to make out. And I sat there in my saddle in the falling light, and I watched the gray stallion stand on that grass and face the east and wait. The sun went down behind me. The rimrock caught fire and then faded. A little wind came up and moved through the cottonwoods below with a sound like water. Somewhere, a nighthawk started up its high, lonesome call. And Smoke stood there. He didn't move for the better part of an hour. Then, just as the last light went out of the sky, he did something that put the hair up on my neck. He whinnied. Not the challenge scream of a stud. Not the nicker a horse gives its band. It was a long, high, searching call. The call a horse makes when it's separated from one it loves and it's asking, out into the empty dark, are you there? Are you there, please, are you there? And it rolled out across that whole silent valley and came back off the far hills as an echo, thin and dying. And then there was nothing. No answer. There was never going to be an answer. I knew that much already, though I didn't yet know why. He called again, and again, 3 times into the dark to nobody. And then he dropped his head, and something went out of him. You could see it even at that distance, in the last of the light, the way his whole proud body just sagged. And he turned and walked down off the bench toward the spring, slow, like an old man, like a horse 3 times his age. I sat there in the dark a long while after. Domino stamped and sighed under me. The stars came out thick the way they do out here where there's no other light for 50 miles. I'd spent 11 years believing that horse was the wildest, proudest, most untouchable thing in this country. The whole valley believed it. We'd built a legend on it. And I just watched him break his own heart, calling into the dark for something that wasn't ever coming. I rode home slow. I didn't sleep. Because I'd started to remember something. A little snag of memory, catching and pulling a girl and a gray colt and a bad winter a long time back. Something I'd half heard years ago and never put together. By the time the sun came up I knew I had to go see old Gregorio Alvarez, who'd run sheep in the Owlheads longer than anybody alive and forgot nothing. And I had a terrible feeling. I already knew what he was going to tell me. Gregorio Alvarez was 91 years old, blind in one eye and mostly deaf in the ear he'd let me sit next to, and he remembered the girl the second I described the horse. The gray with the black legs, he said. He was quiet a moment. His good hand, spotted and shaking, found the arm of his chair. You are talking about Nella Sintz's colt. I hadn't heard that name in a dozen years, and the sound of it went through me like cold water. Let me tell you about Nella Sintz, and I'm going to try to tell it plain because it doesn't need any dressing up. The dressing up would only be for my sake, to make it easier to say, and this girl deserves better than for me to make it easy on myself. The Saint's family had a small place up the valley from mine, back when I was still young and strong and full of myself. Good people. Poor, the way everybody out here was poor, but proud and clean and kind. Tamaz Saints was a fair hand and a better neighbor, and his wife Delia could make a Sunday supper out of nothing that bring tears to your eyes. And they had the one child, Nella. I can see her still. Skinny thing, all elbows and knees, black hair she could never keep out of her face, and eyes too big and too serious for a kid. She was horse crazy the way some children just are, born with it, hopeless. From the time she could walk she was out in the corrals, underfoot, fearless, getting stepped on and getting up again. Her daddy used to say the good Lord had made a mistake and put a horse trader's soul in a little girl's body. The winter she was 10, one of the Saint's mares foaled early and died doing it. Bad birth, bad weather, and Tamaz out on the far range and not home to help. Delia found the mare gone cold in the morning and a wet gray colt half frozen beside her, too weak to stand, given up for dead. And 10-year-old Nella wouldn't let him die. She brought that colt into the house, into the kitchen by the wood stove. She wrapped him in every blanket they owned, and she fed him warmed goat's milk from a bottle every 2 hours around the clock. And when the vet said he wouldn't make the night, she just set her jaw. I heard this story a dozen times over the years, always with that same detail. She set her little jaw and she said, "He doesn't know that yet. He made the night, he made the week, he made the spring." She named him Ceniza. That's Spanish for ash, for the color of him. Smoke, the valley would call him, years later, and never know they were only translating a dead girl's name for a horse she'd loved. They grew up together, that's the only way to say it. That colt imprinted on Nella the way a colt raised by hand will, only more so. She'd saved his life with her own 2 hands and her own stubborn will, and something passed between them in that kitchen that winter that I don't fully understand and won't pretend to. He followed her like a dog. He came when she called. She'd ride him bareback across the flats with no bridle, just her hands in his mane and her heels light on his sides, the two of them moving like one animal, and grown cowboys would stop what they were doing to watch, because you knew you were seeing something you'd maybe see once in your life. I saw it myself, more than once, and God forgive me, I was a young man full of my own reputation, and I remember feeling something small and ugly, watching that skinny girl do effortlessly what I trained my whole life to do, sit a horse like she'd been poured into it, like the horse wanted her there. She was the best I ever saw, 10, 12, 14 years old, the best natural hand I ever saw in my life, and I've seen a lot of them. She was going to be somebody. Everybody knew it. There was talk of her going to the big rodeos, the real ones, the ones with money and names. Tamaz was saving for it. Even I put in, 1 year, quiet, into the coffee can Delia kept a little, what I could spare, because whatever small ugliness I'd felt watching her had long since burned off into something more like wonder, and I wanted, in my own way, to be part of it, to have helped her go. She never went. The summer Nella was 15, she got sick. It came on slow and then all at once, the way the worst things do. Tired all the time first, and pale, and then the bruises that wouldn't heal, and then the doctor in town looking grim and sending them to the city, and the word coming back down the valley that landed on all of us like a stone. I won't write the word. You know the word. It's the one that used to be a death sentence for a poor ranch girl a long way from any hospital that could have done a thing for her, and it was a death sentence for Nella Saints. She was sick a little under a year. I went to see her near the end. I want you to know that. It was the hardest thing I ever did, and I almost didn't have the courage, and if Rosa hadn't taken my hand and walked me up to that door, I don't think I'd have gone at all, and I'd have carried that shame to my own grave. She was in her bed by the window, so thin by then, so small, but her eyes were the same, too big and too serious, and still, somehow, when she looked at me, kind. She asked me, in a voice gone thin as paper, if I'd seen Ceniza, if he was all right, if somebody was riding him so he wouldn't get lonesome. Because that was the thing that grieved her, not herself, not the dying. It was the horse. She was 15 years old and dying, and what she couldn't bear was that her horse wouldn't understand where she'd gone. I told her yes. I told her he was fine, that he was the finest horse in the valley and everybody looked after him and he wasn't lonesome at all. I don't know if it was a lie. I hope it wasn't. She smiled when I said it and closed her eyes, and I got out of that room before I came apart. Nella Seentz died in October with the cottonwoods gold along the creek. She was 15. They buried her up on the bench above the spring below Coyote Rim, because that was her favorite place in all the world. The place she'd ride Seneza to and sit for hours looking out over the whole valley, the two of them, girl and horse, facing east into the morning. You already know. I know you already know, but let me finish it anyway because she deserves to have it finished. After she passed, the family couldn't bear the ranch. Too much of her in it. They sold out and moved to the city within the year, and they turned Seneza loose before they went, because he was hers and no one else's, and it would have felt like a sin to sell him. They opened the corral gate and they let him go up into the high country, figuring he'd join up with the wild bands, figuring a horse forgets. A horse does not forget. Not that horse. For 11 years, that gray stallion ran wild and free and untouchable across this country, and the whole valley built a legend about his pride and his defiance and his hunger to be no man's animal. And not one of us, in 11 years, ever once thought to wonder if maybe he wasn't running from anything at all. He was running back. 3 times a year. Spring, when she'd get up early to ride. High summer, when they'd escape the heat on that breezy bench. Fall, October, when she died. He came down out of the mountains and he climbed to the grave of the girl who'd saved his life and loved him better than anything, and he stood over her, and he faced the east where they used to watch the sun come up, and he called for her into the empty dark. 3 times a year, for 11 years. No cowboy could ever catch that stallion. And now you know why. It wasn't that he was too wild or too proud or too clever, though he was all three. It was that every rope thrown at him was trying to take him somewhere, and there was only one place in the whole world that horse was ever going, and it was to her. You cannot catch a thing that is already exactly where its heart lives. I went back out to the bench the next fall, October. I knew he'd come. I don't fully know what I meant to do. I turned it over in my mind all summer and never landed anywhere. Part of me, the old cowboy, the reputation, the pride that never quite dies in a man, part of me still thought maybe I could be the one. That I'd earned it now, that I understood him now, that if any man alive could get a rope on the gray and finally end the legend, it ought to be me, the one who knew the truth. I brought a rope. I want to be honest about that. I rode out there with a rope on my saddle and a story in my head about how I'd be the one. He came at dusk, silver in the failing light, and climbed the bench, and stood over the grave and faced the east. And I sat there on domino in the shadows with my rope in my hand, and I watched him wait for a dead girl to come back to him, and I could not do it. I couldn't do it. What kind of a man ropes a horse off the grave of the child who loved him? What would I even be catching? A trophy, a story to tell, so I could stand him in a corral and call him mine, this animal whose whole heart was buried in the ground under his feet. I thought about Rosa. I thought about the way I stood on my own porch every evening and faced the direction of her grave and waited, in my own way, for something that was never coming. I thought about how the whole valley had looked at this grieving animal for 11 years and seen defiance, seen pride, seen everything except the plain and simple and shattering truth of it, which was that he was just a creature who had lost the one he loved and could not stop going back. I understood him completely. We were the same. I got down off my horse. I dropped the rope in the dirt, and I walked up onto that bench, slow in the dark, with my hands open and empty at my sides. He didn't run. He turned and looked at me, This horse no man had touched in 11 years, and he didn't run. Maybe he was too tired that night. Maybe he'd finally grown old enough not to care. Or maybe, and this is what I believe, though I can't prove it and I don't ask you to, maybe he knew. Maybe he could smell the same grief on me that lived in him. Maybe he understood I hadn't come to take him anywhere, because there was nowhere left to take either one of us. I stood beside him at the grave, close enough to touch. I didn't touch him. It didn't seem like it was mine to do. We stood there together, the old cowboy and the wild horse, over the bones of the girl we'd both, in our different ways, failed to save. The stars came out. The wind moved in the cottonwoods. And after a while, I swear this is true, he lowered his great gray head down next to mine, and he let out a long, slow breath warm against my shoulder in the cold, and it sounded, more than anything else in this world, like a man letting go of something he's carried too long. Then he lifted his head, and he walked off the bench, unhurried into the dark, up toward the high country and the wild bands and the free-ranging life that had never once been what it looked like from the outside. And I let him go. He didn't come back the next spring. I rode out to the bench and I waited 2 days and he never came, and I've made my peace with not knowing why. Maybe he died up in the high country the way old horses do, alone, in some hidden draw where the coyotes found him. Maybe he finally, after all those years, found whatever a horse needs to find to stop going back. I like to think, and an old man's allowed to think what gets him through, I like to think that whatever waits for horses on the far side of that eastern horizon, he went to it, and she was there, 10 years old and skinny and fearless, and he came down the last hill at a dead run with his black mane flying, and she was waiting with her hands out and her big serious eyes gone soft, and she said, "Well, I told you the truth would sit heavy on you. I've kept it 3 winters now and it hasn't gotten light. I still ride out to that bench, October, every year. I sit up there where the 2 of them used to watch the sun come up, and I face the east and I